hikes. Minister Guedes, what about you mentioned that the central bank in Brazil has gotten ahead of the Fed and the inflation fight. So what is the outlook there as far as rates and inflation?
Well, I want to reinforce the importance of the fiscal front, because when COVID came, the federal spending over GDP was 19.5%. When COVID came, we digitalized and assisted 68 million Brazilians with minimum income so that they could face the crisis at social distancing. So the guy used to sell things at a soccer stadium. There's no games, there's no soccer anymore. So how will this guy survive? He's informally employed. He's not at the formal job market. So we created a lot of programs. The first one is this minimum income, 68 million people, digitalized, receiving money every month, $120 every month to 68 million people. Then we created a job preservation program. 11 million jobs preserved. Before firing someone, phone us. Instead of paying full unemployment, which is a minimum wage, I pay half unemployment, half minimum wage, and then you keep the guy. You just reduce the shift hours. Use the guy half of the day, I pay you the other half, and his job is preserved. So it worked beautifully. We preserved 11 million jobs.
Was that your idea?
Was
that your idea, that policy?
Yes. It costed us a lot of money. So we went from 19.5 to 26.5 of GDP. But what happened next year? Bounced back to 18.7% of GDP. So it's not that we didn't spend money. We spent a hell of a lot of money on health. But we cut everything else so that as soon as the disease faded away, we immediately collapsed all expenditures. And they were temporary health expenditures instead of permanent expenditures with the machine. So this result on the fiscal front and the central bank moving ahead of the curve give us the assurance, because when the economy was recovering, instead of letting it go 7.5%, 8% growth, and the fiscal misfunctioning and negative interest rates, we did the other way around. We went ahead of the curve so that we expect that probably we'll get rid of the inflation problem before the advanced economies. And probably we'll be growing faster before the advanced economies, because I think they are largely behind the curve, all of them, Central Bank, Federal Reserve, BCE, because they are not alert to one problem I've been emphasizing when we met. There was a 30 years global cheap labor arbitrage. Alan Greenspan wrote in 2005 a book, The Age of Turbulence, and then he says, beginning of the 20s, the baby boomers will retire. China money will get back to China instead of financing US deficits. And inflation will be higher, because I was happy enough to preside the Federal Reserve in a period when 3.7 billion people jumped into global labor markets. That's 1.5 billion in China, 1.4 billion in India. All these guys jumped in the labor markets. They muted the inflation. And the central banks think they're doing a great job. They're not they're not doing a great job. They're just taking advantage of the global labor arbitrage. So as this global labor arbitrage now was interrupted, China now cannot get more jobs in other countries because the economy is disconnecting, rupturing the chain values in the value chains. So China is decelerating, and wages are going up all over the world, especially in the US, because the unemployment rate is very low. So you have a formidable combination of 4 negative shocks. Wages going up because of the end of the global labor arbitrage. At the same time, disruption in the value chains production, and that's a negative supply shock. At the same time, war, which Ukraine is grains, Russia is about energy. So food and energy going higher. So all this combination, and the central banks, on my view, sleeping at the wheels.
Except for Brazil.
Well, I'm very sorry to inform you that except for Brazil on the monetary front and except for Brazil in the fiscal front.
Patrick,
It just happened.